would you help explain to us the difference between Darwinism and NeoDarwinism?
Sure. Well, Charles Darwin in 1859 published The Origin of Species, and the ideas associated with Darwin have come to be known as Darwinism. Darwin, of course, was completely ignorant of genetics. He didn't know about genetic mutations. He simply talked about variations. And Neo-Darwinism incorporates the discoveries that were made in genetics and then in population genetics in the 20th century. I mean, genetics were first discovered by Gregor Mendel, which Darwin evidently actually had a copy of, but he seems to have never read. But the discoveries of population genetics in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are incorporated to form what is known as Neo-Darwinism. And then, of course, there's the extended synthesis, which is an even newer development in evolutionary theory, where it incorporates discoveries in evolutionary developmental biology as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
When you review the literature, you've gone into a lot of detail and you've presented a lot of papers and things. When you review the current literature on the Darwinian or Neo-Darwinian challenge to intelligent design, is there any direction that they're going in? Are they actually using some science? Because I know up until maybe about 10 years ago, there was very little in the Journal of Molecular Biology or anything like that where it was actually challenging. It was lots of speculation and maybe an if. And are there any new directions that they're going in with actual scientific research?
For the evolutionary side?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are certainly new directions evolutionary developmental biology is a whole new field, and there's been a lot done on that. I think that I'm not convinced by the Evo-Devo models. I've never been very persuaded by the typical rejoinders to intelligent design arguments, such as the arguments of Ken Miller, Brown University, who puts forward these homologous systems, or Nick McLatchie and Mark Hallen, who published in Nature, critiquing the bacterial flagellar argument. I find those arguments to be quite weak, to be honest. I've read a lot of the criticisms of intelligent design, and to be honest, I just don't see them stacking up, either philosophically or scientifically.
Because whenever you speak to a neo-Darwinian evolutionary atheist, and you say, well, what evidence is there for evolution? They go straight to something you mentioned earlier on, the evolution or the development of bacterial resistance. And what I always say to them is that this is evidence of variation. It's not actually new information that's been acquired. It's information that's always been there that is now...
Yeah,
would you recommend a different response or more detail?
The demonstration of molecular homology is not a causal explanation of anything. It just says, okay, so we have two similar systems. It doesn't say that, it doesn't show you how you can go from one to the other. Especially, you have to deal with things like interface compatibility and stuff. And so you require actually, irreducible complexity is best thought of as when you require discontinuous quantum jumps in complexity to take you from one island of function to another. So going from, even if you have the type 3 secretion system or something related to it, building a flagellum from that requires a lot more steps than just saying, okay, we have the type 3 secretion system. Bill Dembski, who's a famous ID theorist, mathematician, philosopher, likened it to saying that we could walk on foot from Los Angeles to Tokyo because we've discovered the Hawaiian Islands. Right, that's the problem, and when you require multiple mutually codependent mutations in order to actualize a new function, that's when the math just doesn't work well for Darwin.
I just so admire your presentation, especially the visualization. It just makes me say, "Wow, the creation," and that I just be more thankful to what we're given, because we as human beings are very unique creation, and I think that just really makes me feel is amazing and we are unique. And I think the evolution theory that explains us to be another evolved species which is similar to other species, I just think that helps me to explain why we are so unique. And this is a question about Richard Dawkins. What perspective is he coming from Darwinism or neo-Darwinism?
Well, Richard Dawkins would be a neo-Darwinian. Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of defining Darwinism and neo-Darwinism in the literature, and not everyone uses it the same way. But no one's a Darwinian in the sense that I mean, Darwin even at one point in his life embraced sort of Lamarckian ideas. And Lamarck, of course, said it basically pioneered the idea of the acquirance or the inheritance of acquired variations. So he talked about the neck of the giraffe, for example, it's stretching its neck to reach higher leaves, and so that's so. I mean, no one's a Darwinian in the sense of holding to everything that Darwin thought. And we obviously know a lot more now since the time of Darwin. So neo-Darwinism basically just incorporates the modern discoveries in genetics and population genetics and so forth. And we understand a lot more about how evolution works and how species give rise, how species are born, how populations can give rise to new daughter species and so on. And we understand a huge amount about evolution and indeed the limitations of evolution.
I wanted to know the differences between macroevolution and microevolution, because a lot of scientists say, okay, macro is hard to prove, but you can observe microevolution.
Sure. It's defined in different ways. I personally don't like the term, I don't like the distinction between micro and macroevolution because it suggests and implies and presupposes that macroevolution is just microevolution given enough time. And I don't think that's the case because, as I said, you can mutate DNA until the cows come home, but much of the information that's responsible for directing the development of a body plan isn't even in the DNA. So, so it's not simply a linear thing. Microevolution, as typically defined, is variations that we observe, even cyclical changes like the finch beaks of Galapagos Islands, which is actually, I think, better explained by phenotypic plasticity rather than natural selection, where they just have an inbuilt plasticity rather than it being evolutionary. But antibiotic resistance, insecticide resistance is something that we observe. It never is the case that you find complex adaptations which are very impressive or would really be able to show how you could explain for complex machinery and complex things in biology given enough time. And many cases of antibiotic resistance are simply cases of modifying a binding site for the antibiotic so it can't bind to it any longer and so on.
Jonathan, you've spoken about intelligent design in your nuanced definition. And you have used examples of bacteria as kind of prime examples in your presentation, and you could have used many, many more. E. coli you used, and also we're talking about salmonella. So the design element there is equally impressive to the design element in other parts of human microbiology. And yet, I think some of us might hesitate in saying God made E. coli.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to theodicy. It's more theological than a scientific question because intelligent design simplicator doesn't tell us anything about the intentions of the designer or the moral character of the designer or the nature or identity of the designer. That requires independent elucidation, and I happen to be convinced that it's the God of the Bible, but that's on independent grounds in my scientific views concerning intelligent design. Now, let's address the question theologically. I mean, just before I get to theology, I mean, you can imagine, for example, a medieval torture rack, right? William Lane Craig has used this example. Medieval torture rack is something which is designed, and we can recognize and infer its design, even though it's designed for malevolent purposes. So it doesn't refute the design inference simplicator. But then, as to whether it undermines the Christian concept of theism, I mean, I am persuaded that all suffering and all malady in nature can ultimately be accounted for by the fall. I mean, I subscribe to the theodicy of Bill Dembski that he put forward in The End of Christianity, where basically he argued, because I'm, as you might have gathered, I'm an old earth person rather than a young earth creationist. And this then raises the question, well, what about the maladies in nature that happened before man sinned? And Bill Dembski puts forward the idea that maybe the fall is actually retroactive with respect to its cause and effect relationship. So you have two worlds intersecting in the Garden of Eden. Remember, Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden, and the raises the question, well, why would you need Adam to be placed in a regional, local garden in a world where the whole world is a garden? And Bill Dembski basically argues that you have two worlds intersecting in the Garden of Eden. The world that God intended, the good and perfect world in the Garden of Eden. And then you have the world that God has prepared in anticipation for the fall, a world into which Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden following the fall. So that's basically the argument. It's a theological argument. We live in a fallen world, and so that's why there's problems, and that's why we have evidence of a fallen world.